Thank you for clicking in this video. Are you ready to confront the unknown? Prepare yourself for a chilling tale that only comes to life on a dark Friday the 13th night. Will you dare to venture into the unknown?
It was one of those nights, you know, the kind where the air feels heavier than usual, like something's watching you, waiting. Of course, I didn't believe in all that superstitious nonsense. Neither did my friends. We were young, invincible, or at least, we thought we were. Friday the 13th had rolled around again, and with it came the usual town chatter about Jack Noit Sombria. Or as they call him in the old stories, Dark Knight Jack. The legend was as old as the town itself, a man who was wronged, betrayed, and murdered on a Friday the 13th long ago. The tale goes that Jack returned from the grave as a twisted figure, masked and silent, to hunt anyone who dared step foot in the forest on that cursed night. We laughed at the absurdity of it all. A masked killer who moves slow but never stops coming. It sounded like something out of an old horror movie. Still, the elders warned us every year. They claimed that strange things happened on Friday the 13th by the lake, but who would take that seriously? A bunch of adults trying to scare us into staying home. It worked on most people, but not us. My friends, Tommy, Sarah, Jake, and Lily had planned this camping trip for weeks. A night by the lake, some drinks, and stories to spook each other. It was the perfect escape. We ignored the warnings, loaded up our backpacks, and headed out at dusk, laughing and making fun of the whole Jack nonsense. The forest felt different that night, though. The further we hiked, the more distant the sounds of the town became. The dense canopy overhead blocked most of the moonlight, and the air had that biting chill you feel deep in your bones. Tommy cracked jokes to ease the tension, but something wasn't right. Every now and then, I'd feel a strange prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone or something was watching us. But when I turned, there was nothing but trees and darkness. We reached the lake just as the last bit of light faded, setting up camp in a clearing. The lake was eerily still, reflecting the shadowy outline of the trees. We built a fire, and as the flames danced, casting flickering shadows across the campsite, the mood shifted. It was time for the legend of Jack. Tommy was the one who brought it up. He was always the loudest, always trying to be the center of attention. "All right, folks, gather round," he said in a dramatic tone, waving a flashlight under his face. "Let me tell you the real story of Dark Knight Jack." We all groaned, but deep down, I think we were all waiting for this. Tommy went on, making the story more gruesome and ridiculous than it had to be. He described Jack as this hulking, masked figure who slaughtered his victims with a machete, dragging them into the woods, where they were never found again. "And guess what?" he added, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Tonight is Friday the 13th. Lily rolled her eyes, Sarah laughed nervously, and Jake threw a stick into the fire. But me? I felt it again, that creeping sensation like we weren't alone. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the story getting to me. But then something happened. Something that, in hindsight, was the first real warning. A loud snap echoed from the tree-line, like a branch breaking underfoot. We all froze, our laughter dying in an instant. Tommy, ever the brave one, turned towards the sound with a grin. "Probably just a deer," he said, but even his voice lacked the usual confidence. We went back to our fun, but I couldn't shake the unease. As the fire died down and the cold night air settled in, we retreated to our tents. Tommy, ever the idiot, decided to set up a hunt for Jack, just for laughs. We were supposed to wander the forest, see who could scare the others the most. I didn't want to play, but I didn't want to be the odd one out either. As we prepared for the hunt, I couldn't help but look over my shoulder again, staring into the dark forest beyond our camp. Was something really out there, or was it just the stories messing with my head? Little did I know, that night would become the longest night of my life. We split up into pairs. Tommy and Lily went one way, Jake and Sarah the other. I was left to wander alone, which was fine by me. I figured it would give me time to clear my head, shake off that creeping paranoia. The firelight flickered in the distance as I stepped into the darkness of the forest, my flashlight casting thin beams that barely caught through the trees. The sounds of my footsteps seemed unnaturally loud, each crack of a twig underfoot sending a jolt through my chest. I wasn't scared, at least that's what I kept telling myself. It was just the forest playing tricks, the way everything seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. Tommy's voice echoed through the trees somewhere in the distance, his obnoxious laugh cutting through the silence. "Jack's coming for you," he yelled, followed by a scream from Lily, probably faking terror just to play along. Typical. I kept walking, my breath visible in the cold air. I should have felt more relaxed being out here alone, away from the group's antics. But there was something wrong. The deeper I ventured into the woods, the more it felt like the night was closing in around me. The trees seemed to stretch taller, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. Every now and then, I'd hear a rustle in the leaves or the snap of a twig that wasn't from my own footsteps. I'd stop, turn, scan the area with my flashlight. But there was never anything there. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, it was hard to tell. Time didn't feel right anymore, like the forest was warping it somehow. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to laugh it off, blaming Tommy's stupid story. But as the silence grew thicker, and the cold settled deeper into my skin, I couldn't laugh anymore. That's when I heard it, a low, steady sound, almost rhythmic, like footsteps crunching through the dead leaves. Not far off, either. I froze, straining to listen, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps stopped. I waited, holding my breath. Nothing. I convinced myself it was one of the others messing with me. Probably Tommy trying to scare me. I was about to call out when I caught sight of something just beyond the reach of my flashlight, a figure. It stood motionless, barely visible in the dim light. My heart jumped into my throat. It had to be Tommy or Jake. But something wasn't right. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It was just standing there, like it was watching me. "Tommy?" I called, my voice shaky, betraying the unease that was now clawing at the edges of my mind. No answer. I stepped closer, squinting to make out more details. Whoever it was, they were tall, with broad shoulders, dressed in something dark, too dark to be normal clothes. My flashlight's beam flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw something that sent a wave of cold terror down my spine. A mask. Not just any mask. It was grotesque, misshapen, like it had been carved from wood by hands that didn't care for symmetry or beauty. Jagged, hollow eye sockets stared back at me, and the mouth was twisted into a permanent snarl. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't Tommy. It wasn't any of us. I took a step back, my breath quickening. The figure still didn't move. It just stood there, silent, watching. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I wanted to turn, to get the hell out of there, but my body refused to obey. My mind raced, piecing together what I didn't want to admit. Jack. Dark Knight Jack. It couldn't be real. It couldn't be real. Suddenly, a branch snapped behind me, and I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my hand. Nothing. When I turned back to where the figure had been, it was gone. Just vanished. My stomach lurched. I wasn't alone out here, and whoever or whatever that was, it wasn't playing a game. I started walking, faster now, my flashlight darting from side to side. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, making the trees creak. The air had turned colder, and a thick fog was starting to roll in from the direction of the lake, obscuring everything in a ghostly veil. I had to find the others. Tell them what I saw. Or maybe I was losing it. Maybe the story was getting to me more than I realized. But deep down, I knew better. Something was out here with us. Something that didn't care if we believed in it or not. And it was hunting. I stumbled back towards the camp, my legs moving faster than my brain could keep up. My breathing was ragged, each inhale burning my lungs in the cold night air. All I could think about was getting back to the others. I needed to warn them, but how would they believe me? They were out there, laughing, completely unaware that someone was watching us. Someone who shouldn't exist. The fog was thicker now, creeping through the trees like fingers clawing at the ground. The beam of my flashlight flickered weakly, barely cutting through the haze. My ears strained for any sound, footsteps, breathing, anything, but all I could hear was my own pulse thudding in my head. The silence was suffocating, and I felt the weight of it pressing down on me as I ran. Finally, I saw the glow of the campfire through the fog. The shapes of the tents loomed ahead, ghostly in the mist. My heart leapt with relief as I burst through the trees into the clearing. Jake was standing by the fire, poking at it with a stick, while Tommy and Lily sat on a fallen log, their backs to me. They were still laughing, completely oblivious. "Guys," I gasped, out of breath. "We need to go. Now." They all turned to look at me, confused. "Whoa, slow down," Tommy said, standing up. "What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." I couldn't stop moving, pacing in front of the fire as I tried to explain. "There's someone out there. I saw him. The mask, it was just like the stories. He's real, Tommy. Jack, Dark Knight Jack is real." Tommy snorted, glancing at Jake. "Dude, come on. You're letting that stupid story get to you." "I'm serious," I snapped, feeling my frustration rise. "I'm not messing around." There was a man. He was standing there, just watching me. I don't know how, but he was there, and then he wasn't. Lily's face paled slightly, and she glanced nervously into the trees. "Are you sure it wasn't Jake or someone else messing with you?" Jake shook his head, stepping closer. "I've been here the whole time. No one's out there, man. It's just your imagination." But deep down, I could see the doubt creeping into their expressions. The fog, the eerie silence, it was all starting to weigh on them too. Sarah, who had been quiet up until now, stood up, wrapping her arms around herself. "Maybe we should leave," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Just to be safe." Tommy scoffed. "Come on, Sarah. We're not leaving because of a campfire story." A sudden noise echoed through the trees, a low, heavy crunch of leaves, like footsteps. We all froze, the sound hanging in the air like a threat. Slowly, we turned our heads towards the dark forest. The fire crackled quietly, but no one moved. Crunch. There it was again. Closer this time. Slow, deliberate footsteps. My pulse spiked, and I could see the fear spreading across their faces. Jake's cocky grin faltered, and Tommy swallowed hard. "Okay, what the hell was that?" Jake muttered, taking a cautious step back from the trees. "I told you," I said, my voice trembling. "We need to go." Before anyone could respond, the footsteps quickened. They weren't slow anymore. They were heavy, approaching fast, thudding against the ground like someone, or something, charging through the underbrush. Lily screamed as a figure emerged from the fog, tall and looming, its face hidden behind that same twisted wooden mask. "Dark Knight Jack." Without a word, he lifted his arm, the glint of a large blade catching the light from the fire. His faceless gaze locked onto us, and the world seemed to freeze in that moment. Everything around me became a blur. Tommy shouting, Sarah backing away in terror, Jake reaching for the campfire poker. Jack took a step forward, and suddenly, everything snapped back into motion. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her towards the lake. The others scattered in different directions, but all I could think of was getting as far away from him as possible. We tore through the trees, our feet slipping on the damp leaves. The fog swallowed us up, making it nearly impossible to see where we were going. I could hear Sarah sobbing beside me, her breath ragged as we ran. The sound of footsteps, those relentless, pounding footsteps, followed us, growing louder with each passing second. I glanced back, my heart skipping a beat as I saw Jack's shadowy form moving through the mist. He didn't run, he didn't have to. He moved with terrifying calm, his blade gleaming in the moonlight. "We need to split up," I shouted, though I wasn't sure it was the right decision. But staying together felt like painting a target on our backs. Sarah nodded, barely able to speak through her panic. "I'll head towards the road," she panted, breaking off to the left. I kept running straight, my legs burning with the effort. The trees loomed taller, and the sounds of the forest seemed to close in around me. My chest heaved with each breath, the cold air stinging my lungs. Suddenly, I tripped over something, a root or a rock, and went sprawling face first into the dirt. Pain shot through my hands as I caught myself, and my flashlight skittered away, disappearing into the fog. Panic surged as I scrambled to my feet, searching for the light. But all I found was darkness and the echo of footsteps. Jack was closer now. I could hear him, his slow, steady movements growing nearer. I didn't wait to see him. I bolted, tearing through the trees in blind terror. Every second felt like an eternity. I didn't know if the others had gotten away, if they were safe, but I couldn't stop. Not yet. And then, the footsteps stopped. I slowed down, my heart pounding in my ears. The silence was deafening. Cautiously, I turned around, expecting to see that masked figure emerging from the mist. But there was nothing. Just trees, fog, and the endless darkness of the woods. I waited, holding my breath, listening. Still nothing. Maybe I'd outrun him. Maybe, for now, I was safe. But deep down, I knew that the night wasn't over. And Dark Knight Jack, he wasn't done with us yet. The silence stretched on, thicker than the fog that clung to the trees. I stood there, my chest heaving, my mind racing as I tried to process what had just happened. Dark Knight Jack had been so close, too close, and now the eerie quiet was more unsettling than the sound of his footsteps. I wiped the dirt from my face, my hands trembling as I scanned the shadows. But there was nothing. No movement, no sound. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. But I knew better. I had to find the others. My pulse pounded in my ears as I took a cautious step forward, each crunch of leaves underfoot sending a spike of fear through my veins. My legs felt heavy, the adrenaline that had carried me so far now turning to lead. I stumbled through the trees, the fog swirling around me, hiding whatever lurked just beyond my sight. "Sarah," I whispered under my breath, hoping she'd somehow hear me. I couldn't shake the image of her running toward the road, her face pale with terror. I prayed she had made it, that she'd gotten away before Jack could catch up to her. But even as I moved deeper into the woods, a sinking feeling gnawed at my stomach. We were all still in this game, and no one ever escaped Dark Knight Jack's game. The fog seemed to grow thicker, pressing in on all sides. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump, convinced that he was just behind me, lurking in the mist. I pushed forward, deeper into the trees, hoping I'd find some clue, something to lead me back to the others. And then, just ahead, I saw it, a faint flicker of light. My heart leaped. It was the campfire, still burning dimly through the fog. Relief flooded through me as I hurried toward it. But the moment I stepped into the clearing, I stopped dead in my tracks. The camp was a wreck. The tents were torn to shreds, fabric flapping limply in the cold breeze. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting an eerie, flickering light over the destruction. Jake, Tommy, Lily, they were nowhere to be seen. My stomach twisted as I surveyed the scene, dread tightening its grip around my throat. And then I saw the symbols. Carved into the trees surrounding the camp were the same strange, jagged symbols I had seen earlier in the forest. Only now, they seemed to pulse with some dark energy, as if they were watching me. My skin crawled as I approached one of the trees, running my fingers over the rough grooves. They were deep, freshly carved. Jack's work. He was marking his territory. Marking us. A twig snapped behind me, and I whipped around, my heart hammering in my chest. But it wasn't Jack. It was Tommy, staggering out of the fog, his face pale and his clothes torn. He looked like he'd been running for hours, his eyes wide with fear. "Tommy!" I called out, rushing over to him. "What happened? Where are the others?" He collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. Jake's gone. Lily too," he panted, his voice shaking. We got separated. He came after us, man. I saw him. He's real." I nodded, kneeling beside him. "I know. We need to get out of here. Now." But Tommy shook his head, his eyes darting around the clearing. "There's no way out. Every time we think we're heading toward the road, we just end up back here. It's like the forest is changing." A chill ran down my spine. The trees, the fog, the way the path seemed to twist and turn, it all made sense now. Jack wasn't just hunting us. He was toying with us, leading us in circles, trapping us in his nightmare. I pulled Tommy to his feet. "We can't stay here. We need to keep moving. Maybe we'll find Sarah or Jake along the way." He nodded weakly, and together we began to make our way back into the woods. The darkness seemed to close in tighter with every step, the fog wrapping around us like a suffocating shroud. The strange symbols glowed faintly on the trees, their jagged lines twisting in ways that made my head throb. I didn't want to think about what they meant. We walked in silence, every rustle of leaves or snap of a branch setting us on edge. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that masked figure standing in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But the woods were empty. Too empty. After what felt like hours, we reached the edge of the lake. The water was still, reflecting the pale moonlight that managed to cut through the fog. I could see our rowboat, bobbing gently against the shore, the only sign that we had ever been here to begin with. "There," I pointed, relief washing over me. "We can take the boat and get across the lake. He can't follow us there." Tommy looked hesitant, but after a moment, he nodded. Yeah, okay. Let's go." We hurried down to the water, the sound of the boat rocking against the dock filling the eerie silence. Just as we reached it, I heard something behind us, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. A footstep. I turned slowly, my blood running cold. Dark Knight Jack stood at the edge of the trees, his tall, shadowy figure framed by the fog. His mask glinted in the moonlight, the grotesque wooden face frozen in a twisted, eerie expression. He didn't move. He didn't have to. His presence alone was enough to freeze us in place. For a long, agonizing moment, none of us moved. Jack stood there, watching, waiting, the gleam of his blade catching the light as it hung at his side. Then, without a sound, he took a step forward. "Go!" I shouted, shoving Tommy toward the boat. We both scrambled inside, fumbling with the oars as Jack slowly advanced. Every instinct in my body screamed to row faster, to get away from the shore, but my hands shook so badly I could barely grip the oars. Finally, we began to move, the boat gliding over the still water. I risked a glance back at the shore. Jack had stopped at the water's edge, watching us with that same cold, unrelenting gaze. For the first time that night, I felt a sliver of hope. "We're going to make it," Tommy whispered, more to himself than to me. But as the fog rolled in thicker around us, and the lake seemed to stretch endlessly into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that Dark Knight Jack was far from finished with us. The boat glided silently across the lake, but the weight of Dark Knight Jack's presence still clung to the air like a noose tightening around us. The fog was thicker now, almost impenetrable, and every splash of the oars against the water echoed ominously. Tommy sat hunched over, his eyes fixed on the shoreline that had disappeared into the mist. Neither of us spoke, but I could feel the tension between us, the silent understanding that we were still in his game. I forced myself to row harder, every muscle burning with exhaustion, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't moving fast enough. The boat creaked with every stroke, and the water seemed to stretch out endlessly before us. How far could this lake possibly go? It felt like we'd been rowing forever. "Do you see anything?" I asked, my voice trembling with the effort to sound calm. Tommy shook his head, his face pale and tight with fear. "Nothing. Just fog." I cursed under my breath and kept rowing. The water slapped against the side of the boat, a rhythmic reminder that we were still trapped, still vulnerable. The forest, the lake, the fog, it was all part of his twisted game. And as long as we were still playing, we weren't safe. "We need to get to the other side," I muttered, trying to focus on the goal. "Once we're out of the woods, we can find help." Tommy nodded, but the fear in his eyes told me he didn't believe we would make it. Not with Jack still out there, lurking somewhere in the fog. And he wasn't wrong to be scared. Jack had always been relentless, always one step ahead. I knew deep down that we couldn't outrun him, not forever. The boat lurched suddenly, and I froze, my grip on the oars tightening. We hit something. The boat tilted slightly, and I felt the cold dread pool in my stomach. It wasn't land. The water was still deep, the shoreline nowhere in sight. "What was that?" Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible. Before I could respond, the boat rocked again, more violently this time, as if something was moving beneath us. The water rippled, and the surface broke with a loud splash. Panic surged through me as I scanned the fog, trying to see what was out there. But there was nothing, just a thick, suffocating mist. "Row!" I shouted, my heart racing. "We need to get out of here." I pulled at the oars with all my strength, but the boat rocked again, nearly tipping us into the water. A dark shape passed beneath us, moving too fast for me to make out, but its presence was unmistakable. Something was circling us, something huge. Tommy scrambled to the edge of the boat, peering into the water. "What is that?" he yelled, his voice rising in panic. I didn't answer. There was no time to explain, no time to think. Whatever it wasn't Jack, it was something else. Something worse. The legends about Dark Knight Jack spoke of him controlling the woods, but no one had mentioned anything about the lake. The boat was pulled sharply to the side, and I nearly lost my balance, falling into the freezing water. My breath caught in my throat as the dark shape surged up again, briefly breaking the surface before disappearing into the depths once more. It was massive, and it was hungry. "We have to swim for it," Tommy shouted, grabbing the edge of the boat. "No." I grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Stay in the boat. We're safer here." But Tommy's panic had taken over. He was already scrambling to get out, convinced that the only way to survive was to swim to shore, wherever that was. Before I could stop him, he leapt over the side, plunging into the icy water with a splash. "Tommy, no!" I shouted, watching helplessly as he thrashed in the water. The dark shape moved faster now, honing in on Tommy's panic splashes. I felt the sickening realization that whatever this thing was, it was hunting him. Desperate, I grabbed one of the oars and plunged it into the water, trying to get his attention. But it was too late. The creature surged up from beneath the surface, a dark, sinuous mass that wrapped itself around Tommy, dragging him under. His scream cut through the air, chilling me to my core. I tried to reach him, but the water swallowed him whole, the surface calm once more. For a moment, I sat frozen, my mind refusing to accept what had just happened. Tommy was gone, swallowed by whatever nightmare lurked beneath this cursed lake. But then, the boat started moving again, this time on its own. The water swirled around me, pulling the boat towards something unseen. My hands shook as I clung to the side, trying to steady myself. Whatever force had taken Tommy was now dragging me deeper into the lake. "No," I whispered, my voice shaking with fear. "Not like this." And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pull stopped. The boat drifted to a halt, the water once again eerily calm. The fog began to lift, just enough for me to see the shoreline ahead. I had made it. Somehow, against all odds, I was still alive. I rowed the boat the final few yards to shore, my hands blistered and raw. As I stepped out onto the muddy bank, I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. I had survived the lake, but at what cost? Tommy was gone, and Jack was still out there, waiting. But I couldn't stop now. I had to keep moving. There had to be a way out of this nightmare. Taking a deep breath, I stumbled into the forest once more, hoping that somehow I could find Sarah and Jake, and maybe, just maybe, save us all from Dark Knight Jack. The forest greeted me with its familiar, suffocating silence. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig seemed amplified, and I couldn't tell if it was just my nerves or if something, or someone, was stalking me. My muscles screamed with fatigue, and every step felt like a battle against the relentless weight of exhaustion. But I couldn't stop. Not now. I called out into the trees, hoping that Sarah or Jake might hear me. My voice echoed in the eerie stillness, but there was no answer. The thick fog from the lake was behind me, but a new darkness was settling in. It was as if the entire forest conspired to keep us trapped. The shadows seemed alive, shifting, moving, whispering our fates. After what felt like hours of wandering through the woods, I saw movement ahead. My heart raced, and I ducked behind a large oak tree, peering out cautiously. It wasn't Dark Knight Jack. It was Jake. He looked like he had been through hell. His clothes were torn, and he was covered in mud and scratches. But most importantly, he was alive. "Jake!" I whispered loudly, stepping out from my hiding spot. Jake spun around, startled, his face pale with fear. Relief flooded his features when he saw me, and he rushed over, grabbing me by the shoulders. "Oh my God, I thought you were dead," he gasped, his voice shaking. "I almost was," I said, feeling the weight of what we had endured settle over me. "But Tommy, he's gone." Jake's face twisted with grief, but there was no time for mourning. "Sarah's still out there," he said, his voice trembling. "I lost her in the woods when we tried to run from Jack." Before I could respond, a distant rustle in the trees made us both freeze. Dark Knight Jack was still hunting. And he was close. "We need to find Sarah and get out of here," I said firmly, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Before he finds us." Jake nodded, and together we moved deeper into the forest, staying low and silent. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward us, and the oppressive weight of Jack's presence felt closer with each step. The air was colder now, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones and made it impossible to think of anything but survival. After what felt like an eternity, we heard a faint noise, crying. It was Sarah. We followed the sound until we found her, huddled beneath a large tree, her face streaked with tears. She looked up as we approached, her eyes wide with terror. "I thought I was alone," she sobbed, pulling herself up to her feet. "You're not," I said, putting a hand on her shoulder. "We're going to get out of this." But as soon as the words left my mouth, the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, echoed through the trees. Dark Knight Jack. The three of us stood frozen, our breaths shallow and rapid as we scanned the darkness for any sign of him. But there was nothing. Just the oppressive silence and the slow, methodical crunch of leaves underfoot, drawing closer. "He's coming," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. My heart pounded in my chest. Running hadn't worked before, and hiding would only delay the inevitable. But then, an idea sparked in my mind. The symbols, the strange markings we had seen earlier carved into the trees, what if they meant something? What if they were some kind of boundary or warning? Something clicked inside me, a desperate hope. If the markings were connected to Jack's territory, maybe we could use them against him. "I think the markings are important," I said quickly. "If we can find them again, maybe we can trap him, or at least keep him at bay." Jake looked skeptical, but he didn't argue. At this point, we had nothing left to lose. We ran through the forest, searching for the strange symbols we had seen earlier. The forest seemed to twist and turn around us, as if it were alive, shifting to confuse us. But finally, after what felt like hours, we found one of the trees, its bark etched with the same strange carvings. "This has to be it," I said, trying to catch my breath. "Stay close to the tree." The footsteps grew louder, closer. Jack was coming, and we were out of time. We huddled around the marked tree, hoping, praying, that the markings would protect us. The cold air grew even colder, the oppressive weight of Jack's presence so thick it was suffocating. And then, we saw him. Dark Knight Jack emerged from the trees, his massive form silhouetted against the night. His grotesque wooden mask glowed faintly in the moonlight, and his Fatsao gleamed menacingly in his hand. He didn't rush, didn't run. He just walked slowly toward us, his head tilted slightly as if he were savoring the moment. But as he drew closer, something strange happened. Jack stopped. He was only a few feet away from us, but he didn't move any closer. It was as if the symbols on the tree were holding him back, creating some kind of invisible barrier between us. "He can't get to us," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking with disbelief. I didn't dare move. Jack stood there, his dark eyes glaring at us through the slits of his mask. He didn't speak, didn't make a sound. He just stood there, watching us, his knife still at his side. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other, locked in a silent standoff. And then, without warning, Jack took a step back. He turned and disappeared into the forest, vanishing into the shadows as quickly as he had appeared. We waited, barely breathing, until we were sure he was gone. The oppressive weight of his presence lifted, and the forest seemed to exhale with us. "He's gone?" Jake asked, his voice trembling with disbelief. "For now," I said, my own voice shaking. But I knew this wasn't over. Dark Knight Jack was a part of this place, a twisted force bound to the legends of the forest. And even though we had survived this night, I couldn't shake the feeling that he would return. But at least for now, we were alive. We gathered ourselves, and as the first hints of dawn began to break through the trees, we made our way out of the forest, the weight of our survival hanging heavily on our shoulders. As the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, the three of us stumbled out of the forest, bruised, battered, but alive. The weight of Dark Knight Jack's presence seemed to lift with the rising sun, and the oppressive stillness of the woods gave way to the chirping of birds and the soft rustle of leaves in the morning breeze. We didn't speak much, the horror of what we had experienced still lingering in the back of our minds. When we reached the edge of town, the familiar sight of houses and streets brought a fleeting sense of relief. But that relief was fragile. Despite the warmth of the sun on our skin, a chill still clung to me, a feeling that something wasn't quite right. Dark Knight Jack had let us go, but why? What had held him back in the forest, and more importantly, would he ever return? We sat on the steps of an old gas station, catching our breath and trying to process everything. Jake was the first to break the silence, his voice shaky but determined. "We should tell the others," he said. "The townspeople. They need to know what happened." Sarah nodded, but I hesitated. Would anyone even believe us? A group of teenagers running from an old legend, claiming to have been hunted by a killer from a ghost story? It seemed far-fetched, even to me, despite having lived through it. But deep down, I knew that Dark Knight Jack wasn't just a story, he was real. The lacerations on my arm, the symbols carved into the trees, the cold terror that had gripped us all night were proof enough. As we made our way into town, people began to notice us. Curious looks, whispers exchanged behind cupped hands. It didn't take long before we were approached by a few older locals, their eyes filled with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost," one of the men said, stepping forward. "What happened out there?" Jake opened his mouth to speak, but before he could get a word out, an elderly woman stepped forward, her face pale. "You went out there, on a night like this?" Her voice trembled with fear. "On Friday the 13th? We thought it was just a story," Sarah said quietly, avoiding the old woman's gaze. "We didn't think it was real." The woman's expression darkened. "The curse of Dark Knight Jack is real," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "He hunts on that night, every Friday the 13th. I warned your parents. I warned the whole town. But young ones always think they know better." I wanted to ask her why Jack hadn't killed us, why he had let us escape, but before I could, another voice interrupted. "It's not over," a man said from the back of the small crowd that had gathered around us. He stepped forward, his eyes sharp with the kind of wisdom that came from living through countless Friday the 13th THS. "Dark Knight Jack doesn't stop. He'll be back. And when he returns, he won't be so merciful." A cold shiver ran down my spine. Merciful. That wasn't the word I'd used to describe Jack. But the man was right about one thing: this wasn't over. Jack was still out there, lurking in the shadows of the forest, waiting for the next unlucky soul to wander into his domain. The next few days were a blur. We were the talk of the town. Some believed us, while others brushed it off as a group of teenagers who had let their imaginations get the better of them. But no one dared go near the forest, not after what we had experienced. And, as if in silent agreement, we never spoke of it again, even among ourselves. Weeks passed, and life slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could after what we had been through. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Dark Knight Jack was still watching, still waiting. Every time I walked near the edge of the forest, I felt his eyes on me, hidden behind that grotesque wooden mask. Then, one evening, as I was lying in bed, my phone buzzed. It was a text message. I picked up my phone, my heart suddenly racing as I unlocked the screen. It was from an unknown number. The message read simply, "Until the next Friday the 13th. I stared at the words, my blood turning to ice. It couldn't be a coincidence. I quickly checked the calendar. My heart sank. Another Friday the 13th was only months away. I lay there, the phone still in my hand, staring at the screen as the reality of it all settled over me like a dark cloud. Dark Knight Jack wasn't finished with us. He had spared us this time. But he would return. And when he did, there would be no escaping him. The thought lingered in my mind as I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The townspeople were right. The legend was real. Dark Knight Jack was real. And the nightmare we had survived was only the beginning. The next time, we might not be so lucky.
If you want to watch another story, there is another video appearing on your screen now. Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more spine-chilling stories.